They came to Richmond's auction house to prove their power, only to expose how desperately they were clinging to it. Because the most dangerous thing on their auction block wasn't the man being sold, it was the truth he brought with him. In the middle years of the 1850s, Richmond, Virginia stood as both a symbol of Southern confidence and a quiet theatre of unease. The city's brick streets and tobacco warehouses carried the weight of generations, while the James River moved steadily past wharves crowded with goods bound for distant markets. To many observers, Richmond appeared prosperous and secure, a place where tradition and hierarchy held firm against the uncertainties of a changing nation. Yet beneath this outward calm, the rhythms of the city were increasingly shaped by a trade that exposed both its wealth and its contradictions. Richmond had become one of the most active centers of the domestic slave trade in the Upper South. Along certain streets, auction houses operated with a regularity that blurred the line between commerce and human tragedy. Enslaved men, women and children were confined in holding pens or jails while brokers negotiated their sale, their lives reduced to ledger entries and whispered appraisals. Traders moved between Richmond and the expanding plantations of the Deep South, feeding a system that depended on constant movement and separation. Some accounts describe the sound of chains and the murmur of crowds at auctions, where families were divided under the watchful eyes of buyers calculating labor value and profit. The institutions that sustained this system were not hidden in the shadows, but woven into the city's economic fabric. Banks extended credit using enslaved people as collateral, while legal contracts formalized transactions that treated human lives as transferable assets. Prominent firms and respected businessmen participated openly, lending the trade a veneer of legitimacy. For the city's elite families, this network of finance and ownership reinforced their social standing. Land, inheritance, and enslaved labor formed the foundation of their influence, and maintaining that foundation required careful management of both wealth and reputation. Yet the appearance of stability often concealed fragile realities. Many of these elite households operated under significant debt, relying on future profits to sustain present prestige. Credit networks stretched across counties and states, binding families together in obligations that could unravel with a single failed harvest or market downturn. Some records suggest that behind the polished facades of Richmond's grand homes were private anxieties about solvency, inheritance disputes, and the pressures of maintaining status in a competitive and shifting economy. At the same time, the moral and political climate surrounding slavery was becoming increasingly strained. While the system projected permanence, it faced growing scrutiny from both within and beyond the South. Newspapers carried debates that hinted at deeper divisions, and travelers passing through Richmond sometimes remarked on the contrast between its genteel society and the visible realities of the slave trade. Oral histories indicate that, even among those who benefited from the system, there were moments of unease, quiet acknowledgements that the structure supporting their world was not as unshakable as it seemed. In this atmosphere, Richmond existed in a state of tension between confidence and vulnerability. The city's streets, markets, and institutions continued to function with practiced efficiency, yet the forces shaping its future were already in motion. Beneath the routines of trade and tradition, questions lingered about debt, power, and the human cost of an economy built on bondage. As the decade advanced, these undercurrents would grow more difficult to ignore, gradually pulling Richmond and the society it represented toward a reckoning that few could fully foresee. On a humid morning in Richmond, sometime in the mid-1850s, a crowd gathered outside one of the city's slave auction houses, drawn not by spectacle alone but by the promise of opportunity. Carriages lined the street, their polished wheels catching the light, while well-dressed men stepped down with measured confidence, their faces composed in the practiced restraint of Virginia's elite. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that accompanied high stakes and whispered rumors of something unusual about the sale. The auction began as many did, with the reading of names, ages, and skills, each detail offered as evidence of value. Yet as the bidding unfolded, it became clear that this sale would not follow familiar patterns. Offers rose quickly, then sharply, as if driven by something beyond ordinary calculation. Some accounts suggest that the men competing for ownership were not merely evaluating labor, but responding to pressures that had been building long before they entered the room. Debts to settle, reputations to protect, fortunes that seemed increasingly uncertain. In In that moment, the logic of slavery revealed itself in its starkest form. Human lives were not only commodified but entangled in the fragile ambitions of those who claimed to own them. Each bid carried more than a price. It carried the weight of expectation, of risk, and of a system that demanded constant expansion to sustain itself. What might have appeared at first glance as confidence and authority began to take on a different character, one marked by urgency, even desperation. Observers at such auctions sometimes remarked on the intensity that could overtake these gatherings. Voices grew sharper, gestures more abrupt, and the careful decorum of the Southern gentleman occasionally gave way to something less controlled. In these moments, the pursuit of ownership seemed to distort not only the lives of the enslaved, but also the character of those seeking to possess them. The transaction, meant to affirm power and stability, instead exposed how precarious that power could be. This auction, though striking, was not an isolated anomaly. Rather, it offered a window into the deeper workings of a system that defined Richmond and much of the South. The true story was not about any single individual placed on the auction block, but about the network of institutions, beliefs, and dependencies that made such scenes possible. Within that network, the boundaries between wealth and vulnerability, authority and anxiety, were far less certain than they appeared. As the bidding reached its peak and the final sale was declared, the room settled into a quiet that carried its own meaning. What had just taken place was both routine and revealing, a reflection of a society that insisted on its own permanence, while quietly straining under its contradictions. In the echo of that moment, the deeper narrative began to emerge, not of a singular event, but of a system whose pursuit of control was beginning in subtle but undeniable ways to unravel those who upheld it. In Richmond during the 1850s, the slave trade operated not at the margins of society, but at its very center, structured with the precision of a marketplace and the authority of law. Enslaved people were brought into the city from surrounding counties and states, confined in holding facilities where they waited, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, before being presented for sale. These spaces were not hidden from public view. They stood as part of the city's commercial landscape, places where human lives were prepared, or assessed and transferred with an efficiency that mirrored any other form of trade. Before an auction could take place, each individual was subjected to a process that reduced identity to inventory. Traders recorded names, though these were not always accurate, along with ages, physical condition, and perceived skills. Some accounts suggest that such details were often altered or selectively presented to increase value, blurring the line between documentation and deception. Buyers examined bodies with clinical detachment, looking for signs of strength or illness, while traders emphasized qualities that might justify a higher price. In these moments, the language of commerce masked the reality of coercion, transforming lived experience into negotiable terms. The system depended heavily on paperwork, which carried the weight of legitimacy. Bills of sale, certificates of ownership, and transport records created the appearance of order and legality. Yet beneath this structure, the reliability of such documents could be uncertain. Cases occasionally emerged in which claims of ownership were disputed or manipulated, and forged papers circulated within networks that prioritized profit over truth. Courts, rather than dismantling these practices, often reinforced them, adjudicating disputes in ways that preserved the broader system. In doing so, legal authority became intertwined with the very mechanisms that enabled exploitation. Financial institutions played an equally critical role. Banks and lenders accepted enslaved people as collateral, extending credit that allowed traders and planters to expand their operations. These arrangements tied the value of human lives to fluctuating markets, embedding slavery within a larger web of economic dependency. A single transaction in an auction house could ripple outward, affecting debts, investments, and reputations across the region. The trade was not isolated. It was sustained by cooperation among brokers, financiers, and officials who understood their roles within a shared system. What made this structure particularly enduring was its acceptance by respectable society. Prominent citizens attended auctions, conducted business with traders, and participated in a culture that treated these transactions as ordinary. Churches, newspapers, and civic institutions rarely challenged the foundations of the trade, instead reflecting a broader consensus that framed it as necessary or inevitable. This normalization allowed the machinery of buying and selling human beings to operate in plain sight, its violence obscured by routine and reinforced by custom. Within this context, the auction house stood as more than a physical location. It became a symbol of a system in which commerce and organized violence were inseparable, where the language of contracts and markets concealed the force required to sustain them. Each sale represented not only an economic exchange, but also the exercise of power over individuals whose consent was never considered. In Richmond, the mechanisms of trade did not soften the realities of slavery. They refined and legitimized them, revealing how deeply the institution was embedded in both the economy and the conscience of the society that upheld it. Before the auction house in Richmond became the center of attention, there had already been troubling stories moving eastward through Virginia, carried along roads used by drovers, traders, and chained coffles. In the hill country of Western Virginia, where distances were longer and official control often felt thinner, a traveling slave trader was said to have encountered a disturbance that unsettled even men accustomed to violence. The details were never fixed in one form. They appeared in fragments, repeated in taverns, on porches, and in county gossip, each retelling shaped by fear, pride, and the need to explain what had gone wrong. According to some accounts, the trader had been moving a group of enslaved people across rough terrain under close guard, expecting the journey to end as so many others did, with delivery, inspection, and sale farther east. But somewhere along that route, the order on which the trade depended seemed to break apart. Rumors spoke of broken chains found where no struggle had been officially recorded, of missing captives who seemed to vanish between one checkpoint and the next, and of a trader so shaken by the event that he collapsed soon afterward, either from exhaustion, panic, or the sudden recognition that control could fail. Records from such moments were often incomplete, and silence itself became part of the story. What could not be neatly documented entered the realm of rumor, where fact and fear reinforced one another. In a society built on coercion, such stories carried real power. Traders depended not only on weapons and legal claims, but on the belief that their authority was absolute and that resistance could be contained. When that belief was disturbed, even briefly, it revealed how unstable the system could become. A missing person was more than a financial loss. A broken chain was more than damaged property. Each detail suggested that beneath the routines of transport and sale, enslaved people were never passive within the machinery built to confine them. They watched, waited, calculated terrain, weather, distance, and human weakness. Resistance did not always survive in formal archives, but traces of it endured in the alarmed language of those who profited from slavery. For traders, fear traveled quickly. A single unexplained incident could grow larger with every mile, transformed into a warning about dangerous routes, unreliable guards, or captives believed to be unusually determined. In these retellings, panic often exposed the mindset of the traders themselves. Men who presented their business as disciplined and lawful could become deeply superstitious about disorder, especially when violence failed to produce obedience. The collapse of one trader, whether physical or emotional, mattered because it suggested that the trade's agents were not masters of events so much as anxious managers of constant risk. This earlier disturbance in Western Virginia also revealed how rumor functioned inside slave society. Enslaved communities passed news in guarded forms, often through gesture, memory, and whispered repetition, while white communities spread their own versions shaped by dread and self-protection. One side understood that escape, delay, and resistance were possible. The other understood, sometimes reluctantly, that force had limits. Out of that tension came stories that were rarely clean or complete, but deeply revealing all the same. By the time attention returned to Richmond, these earlier murmurs had already prepared the ground. The auction there would seem, on the surface, like an ordinary climax of the trade, a place where law and money restored order. But the disturbance in Western Virginia suggested otherwise. It showed that long before the bidding began, the network itself was strained by resistance, secrecy, and fear. What happened in the capital would not emerge from a stable system at all. It would emerge from one already rattled by the people it sought to possess, and by the growing panic of the men who depended on possession for their power. By the time the sale in Richmond drew its crowd, another detail had begun to circulate among traders and buyers, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. A young enslaved man had arrived at the auction house under circumstances that no one could fully clarify. He had not come with the usual chain of paperwork that traced ownership from one hand to another. There were no neatly ordered documents to confirm his origin, no clear record of transfer that would satisfy even the flexible standards of the trade. Yet he was there, placed among others awaiting sale, as if the absence of certainty itself could be absorbed into the system without consequence. In Richmond's market, such irregularities were not unheard of, but they were rarely acknowledged so openly. The trade depended on the appearance of order, on the assurance that each person could be accounted for, valued and transferred within a recognized framework. This young man's presence exposed how fragile that framework could be. If documentation could be incomplete, altered, or entirely absent, then the boundary between lawful transaction and outright seizure became difficult to define. The system did not pause to resolve these questions. Instead, it moved forward, incorporating uncertainty as just another condition of business. What set this young man apart, according to several accounts, was not only the ambiguity surrounding him, but the impression he made upon those who saw him. Descriptions varied, as they often do, but many emphasized a striking appearance and an unusual composure. He did not seem to perform the expected gestures of fear or submission in ways that reassured buyers. Instead, his presence unsettled the room in quieter ways. Some observers interpreted this as confidence, others as defiance, and still others as something they could not easily name. In a setting built on control, even the perception of self-possession could disrupt expectations. Among the assembled elites, reactions began to shift from curiosity to fixation. Bidders who might otherwise have acted with calculated restraint found themselves drawn into speculation. Who was he, and how had he entered the market without a clear claim? Was his value diminished by uncertainty or increased by it? In these questions, the logic of slavery revealed another of its contradictions. The same system that demanded strict definitions of ownership could also be seduced by the allure of the unknown, especially when it promised distinction or advantage. As interest grew, so did the projections placed upon him. Some buyers appeared to see in him an opportunity to assert control over something rare or exceptional, a way to reinforce their own status through possession. Others seemed unsettled, as if his presence hinted at gaps in the system they relied upon. In the absence of clear facts, imagination filled the space. Stories formed quickly, shaped less by evidence than by the desires and anxieties of those telling them. The young man became, in effect, a surface onto which competing visions were cast. This moment revealed something deeper than the fate of a single individual. It showed how enslavers often constructed meaning around the people they claimed to own, interpreting behavior, appearance, and silence through the lens of their own expectations. The young man's composure, whether deliberate or simply misread, became a kind of mirror. In it, the buyers saw not him as he was, but reflections of their own ambitions, fears, and uncertainties. The market, which claimed to reduce human lives to measurable value, instead exposed how unstable and subjective that valuation could be. As the auction prepared to proceed, the tension surrounding him lingered in the room. The lack of documentation had not halted the process. It had merely introduced a new layer of speculation into it. In that sense, his arrival did not disrupt the system so much as reveal its deeper nature. A structure capable of absorbing doubt, reshaping it, and continuing forward, even as the very foundations of its authority were quietly called into question. As the moment of decision approached, the uncertainty surrounding the young man did not halt the machinery of the auction. Instead, it set into motion another, quieter process, one that operated behind desks, in side rooms, and through the exchange of papers that carried the weight of authority whether or not they deserved it. The absence of clear documentation was not treated as a barrier, but as a problem to be managed. In Richmond's slave market, such problems were often resolved not by investigation, but by fabrication. Auction operators and brokers, accustomed to the irregularities of the trade, began to assemble a version of legitimacy. A bill of sale could be drafted, names inserted, dates adjusted to create the appearance of continuity. Signatures, whether authentic or imitated, provided a surface of credibility that few in the room were inclined to challenge too closely. Records from the period suggest that such practices were not exceptional. They were part of a broader pattern in which paperwork did not necessarily reflect truth, but rather the needs of the transaction at hand. This quiet manipulation revealed how deeply fraud had become embedded within the internal slave trade. The system depended on documentation, yet it also tolerated and at times required its distortion. Traders understood that profit often lay in the ability to move quickly, to present a person as saleable regardless of gaps in their recorded history. Legal forms became tools not only of order, but of convenience, flexible enough to accommodate uncertainty as long as the exchange could proceed. For those involved, the calculation was rarely hidden. The risks of questioning a sale too closely could outweigh the risks of accepting it. Buyers trusted that the system, with its courts and contracts, would ultimately protect their claims, even if those claims rested on unstable foundations. Sellers, in turn, relied on the shared interest of all parties in maintaining the flow of commerce. In this way, the line between legality and illegality blurred, not through open defiance of the law, but through its selective application. Within this environment, vulnerability extended beyond the enslaved individuals already bound within the system. Free black people, especially those traveling without extensive documentation, faced the constant danger of being swept into this machinery. A missing paper, a disputed identity, or a false claim could be enough to place someone in a position where their freedom was questioned and their status redefined. The same mechanisms that allowed traders to legitimize uncertain ownership could also be used to erase legitimate claims to liberty. The young man at the center of the auction embodied this uncertainty. His lack of clear origin did not disqualify him. It made him subject to the very processes designed to resolve ambiguity in favor of profit. Once papers were produced, however questionable their origins, they became part of the record, and the record itself became the justification for the sale. In this way, the system did not merely tolerate illegality, it absorbed and normalized it, transforming acts of deception into routine practice. What unfolded in that moment was not an aberration, but a reflection of how slavery functioned in practice. The law provided a framework, but the daily operation of the trade depended on flexibility, compromise, and a willingness to overlook inconsistencies. The appearance of order was maintained, even as the substance beneath it shifted to accommodate the demands of the market. In Richmond's auction houses, the distinction between lawful transaction and organized exploitation was not always clear, because the system itself relied on both to sustain its power. As word of the unusual sale spread through Richmond's social circles, it drew in families whose fortunes and reputations were already entangled with the fragile economy of slavery. Among them were the Whitmores, a name once associated with steady plantation wealth but now shadowed by decline. Their lands, though still expansive on paper, had begun to yield less certainty with each passing season, and the debts that sustained their household were growing harder to ignore. The family patriarch, conscious of how quickly status could erode, viewed the auction as an opportunity not merely to acquire labor, but to reassert a sense of control. To possess something rare, something others desired, offered a way to project strength even as his financial footing weakened. Within the household, however, tensions had already taken root. Disagreements over spending, inheritance, and the future of the estate simmered beneath polite conversation, revealing a family held together as much by expectation as by stability. In contrast, the Preston family represented a different dimension of power, one shaped not only by Southern tradition but by connections that extended into Northern capital and political influence. Their wealth was less visibly strained, yet it carried its own contradictions. A younger member of the family, navigating both ambition and uncertainty, became particularly interested in the sale. For him, the acquisition promised more than economic return. It seemed, in his calculations, a way to stabilize a life that felt increasingly unsettled, marked by financial pressures and a marriage that reflected the broader divisions of the era. His wife, influenced by anti-slavery sentiment more common in northern circles, viewed the institution with growing unease. Her presence introduced a tension that could not easily be resolved within the household, where personal conviction and social expectation collided in quiet but persistent ways. Beyond these prominent families, the auction drew a wider array of participants, each representing a different face of the same system. Investors arrived with ledgers in mind, measuring potential returns against the risks of an uncertain market. Widows, managing estates left to them in a society that limited their formal authority, approached the sale with a careful blend of caution and necessity, seeking to preserve what remained of their security. Speculators moved through the crowd with practiced ease, attentive to opportunity and indifferent to origin, their interest guided by the possibility of profit rather than the stability of ownership. There were also quieter figures, Men whose influence was not always visible but whose decisions shaped the flow of capital and credit that sustained the trade. What united these varied bidders was not a shared motive, but a shared participation in a system that accommodated all of them. For some, the purchase promised status, a reaffirmation of place within a competitive social hierarchy. For others, it represented profit, another transaction in a broader strategy of accumulation. Still others were drawn by a desire for control, an assertion of authority in a world where that authority felt increasingly uncertain. And for a few, there was something more difficult to define, an intensity that bordered on fixation, as if the act of possession itself held a deeper unspoken significance. As they gathered within the auction house, their differences remained visible, yet they converged around a single act. Each bid they prepared to make would reflect not only individual intention, but the collective logic of a system that allowed such intentions to coexist. In that convergence, the auction became more than a marketplace. It became a stage on which the anxieties, ambitions, and contradictions of Richmond's elite were quietly revealed, bound together by a shared reliance on a structure that demanded both belief and participation to endure. As the auction commenced, what had begun as a gathering of composed and calculating men gradually transformed into something far less controlled. The opening bids followed familiar rhythms, measured and deliberate, as if each participant were determined to maintain the appearance of rational commerce. Yet it did not take long for that restraint to erode. The price began to climb in sudden, uneven leaps, each new offer less tethered to ordinary valuation than the last. Murmurs spread through the room, not of approval but of surprise, as seasoned observers recognized that the sale was moving beyond the boundaries of typical exchange. Those present could sense the shift, even if they did not name it aloud. What unfolded was no longer a matter of assessing labor or calculating return. The young man at the center of the auction had become something else entirely, a focus of competition that drew out impulses rarely displayed so openly. Voices rose more quickly, gestures lost their measured quality, and the careful distance that usually separated buyer from object began to collapse. Some accounts suggest that even those who had no intention of bidding felt compelled to remain, as if witnessing a moment that revealed more than it should. In this atmosphere, the bidders themselves became the subject of attention. Each offer carried an intensity that spoke less of necessity than of desire, a need not simply to acquire, but to prevail. Rivalries that had long existed beneath the surface of Richmond's social world found expression in the rising price, as men sought to outbid one another in a contest that was as much about status as it was about possession. The logic of slavery, which claimed to reduce human life to measurable worth, instead exposed its own contradictions. Value became untethered from utility, shaped instead by pride, fear of loss, and the urge to assert dominance in the presence of peers. As the bidding reached extraordinary levels, the room itself seemed to acknowledge that something had gone awry. There were glances exchanged, moments of hesitation, and a growing awareness that the sale had become a spectacle. What had been presented as ordinary commerce now revealed itself as something closer to performance, a display in which the participants could not fully control their roles. In that sense, the auction functioned as a mirror, reflecting back to those present the extremity of the system they upheld. It showed how easily the pursuit of ownership could override reason, transforming calculated men into competitors driven by forces they scarcely acknowledged. When the final bid was declared and the room fell into a strained quiet, the consequences extended beyond the moment itself. The winning bidder, having secured his claim at a price that exceeded all expectation, was left to reckon with the cost of his decision. To complete the purchase, he turned to the familiar mechanisms of credit, mortgaging his estate and binding his future to a debt that could not easily be repaid. Such actions were not unheard of, but they'd revealed the precarious foundation on which many fortunes rested. Land, enslaved labor, and reputation were all leveraged in a system that demanded continual risk. In the days that followed, the implications became clearer. The estate that had once signified stability now carried the weight of obligation, its value tied to the success of a decision driven as much by pride as by calculation. Family members, already strained by existing pressures, found themselves drawn into the consequences, their disagreements sharpened by the realization that one act had placed them all in jeopardy. The purchase, intended to assert control and restore standing, instead exposed the vulnerability at the heart of that ambition. This moment illuminated a broader truth about the world in which it occurred. Slavery was not only a system of labor, but a structure deeply intertwined with vanity, speculation, and the performance of status. The auction had revealed how quickly the pursuit of prestige could lead to ruin, how the desire to possess could override the instinct to preserve. In Richmond, as in much of the South, wealth was often less secure than it appeared, sustained by credit and confidence as much as by tangible assets. When those forces faltered, even briefly, the consequences could be profound. The sale, in all its success, lingered as a cautionary example. Though few would openly describe it as such, it demonstrated how the institutions of slavery, while projecting strength and permanence, were capable of drawing their own supporters into cycles of risk and instability. In that sense, the auction did more than transfer ownership. It revealed the hidden costs of a system that demanded not only the subjugation of others, but the constant proving of one's own place within it, even at the edge of collapse. In the weeks following the purchase, the plantation did not absorb its newest arrival in the expected way. Rather than being assigned to the fields or placed within the established routines of labor, the young man was kept unusually close to the main house. His presence, neither fully integrated nor clearly defined, unsettled the delicate order that governed daily life. On plantations, such hierarchies were rigidly enforced, with every individual's role reinforcing the authority of the household. To disrupt that structure, even subtly, was to introduce uncertainty into a system that depended on clear divisions. Among the enslaved community, this change did not go unnoticed. Some accounts suggest a quiet unease began to spread, shaped by observation rather than open discussion. The proximity of the newcomer to the white family raised questions that could not safely be asked aloud. It suggested favor, or perhaps scrutiny, or something more difficult to interpret. In a world where survival often depended on understanding the intentions of those in power, ambiguity itself could become a source of anxiety. The routines that once provided a measure of predictability now carried an added tension, as if the balance of the household had shifted in ways no one fully understood. Within the family, existing fractures deepened. The financial strain created by the purchase quickly became a point of contention, particularly between brothers whose interests had never fully aligned. One saw the decision as reckless, an act of pride that endangered the estate and all who depended on it. The other defended it as necessary, a calculated risk in a world where standing still could mean decline. Their arguments, at first contained, began to surface more openly, revealing not only disagreements over money but competing visions of authority and control. What had once been managed through silence now demanded confrontation. The mistress of the house, observing these changes from within the private sphere, found herself increasingly unsettled. Her concerns were not limited to finances or reputation, but extended into the realm of personal security and hidden truths. The presence of the young man, so close to the household yet so undefined in his place, seemed to disturb more than routine. It stirred associations and suspicions that had long been kept at a distance. In a society that relied on appearances, the preservation of secrecy was as important as the maintenance of wealth. Now, both felt at risk. As days passed, the household began to reveal what had previously been concealed. The newcomer's presence acted less as a cause than as a catalyst, bringing into focus tensions that had long existed beneath the surface. Allegations emerged in fragments, suggestions of infidelity, of private arrangements that contradicted public respectability, of relationships that blurred the boundaries between power and exploitation. These were not entirely unexpected within the context of plantation life, but their exposure threatened to destabilize the carefully constructed image of the family. More troubling still were whispers concerning the origins of the enslaved workforce itself. Some records from the period indicate that the internal slave trade was not always conducted through transparent or lawful means. Claims began to circulate that members of the household had, at various times, acquired individuals through questionable transactions, purchases made without clear documentation, or through intermediaries whose methods were known to be coercive. In the most serious accounts, there were suggestions of outright kidnapping, of free black individuals taken and absorbed into the system under false claims of ownership. Whether each of these allegations could be proven was less significant than the effect they produced. Together, they pointed toward a reality that many preferred not to examine too closely, that the stability of plantation life often rested on acts that blurred or entirely erased the distinction between legality and crime. The young man's unclear origin made these questions unavoidable. If his presence could be justified without proof, then so too could the histories of others whose stories had been lost or deliberately obscured. In this way, the household came to reflect the broader contradictions of the society around it. Authority remained outwardly intact, yet it was increasingly challenged from within by debt, conflict, and the gradual surfacing of truths that could no longer be easily dismissed. What had once appeared as a stable structure began to resemble something far more fragile, sustained not by certainty, but by the continued suppression of doubt. In the months that followed, the strain within the plantation household no longer remained contained in arguments or uneasy silences. It began to manifest in ways that unsettled even those accustomed to hardship. Illnesses appeared suddenly and lingered without clear cause. Accidents occurred with a frequency that felt less like coincidence and more like consequence, and the boundaries between misfortune and inevitability grew increasingly difficult to distinguish. Some accounts describe a pattern of events that seemed to follow the family's decline, each incident deepening a sense that something within the household had begun to unravel beyond repair. Yet these moments were not experienced as supernatural disturbances, but as the visible signs of a deeper collapse. The purchaser, once driven by determination and pride, showed clear signs of deterioration. His decisions became erratic, his temper less controlled, and his confidence, once the foundation of his authority, gave way to agitation and withdrawal. Those around him observed a man no longer sustained by certainty but haunted by the consequences of what he'd chosen to secure. The system that had promised him control now demanded constant justification, and in that demand, it exposed the limits of his belief in it. Within the household, denial began to break apart. Conversations that had once been avoided could no longer be contained, and the weight of hidden truths pressed into daily life. The presence of the young man, still near and still undefined in his place, seemed to intensify this process. He did not need to act overtly to influence the household. His very existence, tied to uncertainty and unresolved questions, forced others to confront what they had long ignored. In this way, the breakdown was not imposed from outside, but emerged from within, as the moral contradictions of the system became increasingly difficult to sustain. For the enslavers, this moment revealed a profound vulnerability. The ideology that supported their authority depended on distance, on the ability to separate belief from reality, ownership from violence. Once that distance collapsed, the justification for their position became harder to maintain. The purchaser's decline came to symbolize this broader truth. As he faced, however incompletely, the human cost of his actions, the framework that had once guided him lost its coherence. What remained was not clarity, but disorientation, a sense that the structure he relied upon could not withstand scrutiny. Beyond the plantation, similar fractures were appearing within Richmond's wider society. Among another prominent family, the aftermath of the auction produced its own crisis. A failed attempt to secure the same purchase had already strained their finances, exposing the risks they had taken in pursuit of status. Within that household, the consequences took a more public form. The wife, increasingly unwilling to reconcile her position with the realities of slavery, rejected both the transaction and the values that had driven it. Her departure, rare and deeply consequential, disrupted not only the family's internal balance but also its standing within the community. What had once been managed as private disagreement became a visible break, carrying financial and social repercussions that could not be easily contained. As these events unfolded, public perception began to shift. Newspapers, while often cautious in their language, hinted at irregularities and excesses associated with the auction. Gossip moved more freely, passing through social circles with a mixture of fascination and judgment. The very event that had been intended to affirm power and prestige now served as a point of scrutiny. It revealed to those willing to see it how closely ambition, debt, and moral compromise were intertwined. The image of control that Richmond's elite had carefully maintained began to show signs of strain. Amid this atmosphere, one participant in the auction found himself unable to retreat into silence. His involvement, once a matter of routine, became a source of reflection that he could not easily dismiss. Accounts suggest that he began to speak, cautiously at first, about the nature of the trade and his place within it. Such expressions were rare, and they carried significant risk, but they also marked a departure from the shared understanding that sustained the system. In acknowledging his complicity, he opened a space, however limited, for the possibility of conscience within a structure that discouraged it. This divergence in response became increasingly apparent. Some individuals, confronted with the consequences of their actions, sought to reinforce their beliefs, doubling down on the justifications that had long supported them. Others, faced with the same realities, began to question those foundations, moving toward a form of reckoning that was as uncertain as it was necessary. In this contrast, the broader significance of the moment emerged. The system that had once appeared stable was not only challenged by external forces, but also by internal pressures it placed on those who upheld it. Together, these developments traced a pattern that extended beyond any single household or event. They revealed how the structures of slavery, built on control and sustained by denial, could falter when exposed to their own contradictions. The deaths, the departures, the public scrutiny, and the private confessions all pointed toward a society in which the cost of maintaining the illusion of order was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. In that tension, the first signs of a deeper transformation began to take shape, not yet fully realized, but impossible to ignore. As the consequences of the auction rippled outward, another figure began to emerge in scattered accounts, a man whose past placed him at the very edge of the system, now showing signs of fracture. He had once worked as a slave catcher, moving between counties and states, tracking those who fled and returning them to bondage for a fee. His knowledge of routes, networks, and human behavior had made him effective in his role, but it also left him uniquely positioned to observe the changes taking place. Over time, his work brought him into contact with stories that did not fit the patterns he had come to expect. He began to notice that certain traders no longer appeared along familiar circuits. Their absence explained only vaguely, if at all. Coffles that should have reached their destinations arrived diminished or not at all. Reports surfaced of individuals who had vanished between sale points, leaving behind no clear trace. At first, these incidents could be dismissed as isolated failures, poor management, difficult terrain, or the ordinary risks of the trade. But as they accumulated, they suggested something more coordinated, a pattern that extended beyond any single journey or transaction. Through his movements, he encountered fragments of rumor that seemed to echo one another across distance. Enslaved people spoke, when they could do so safely, of routes that offered possibility rather than confinement, of moments when control slipped and opportunity appeared. Traders, by contrast, spoke in guarded terms of unease, of growing difficulty in maintaining order, and of a sense that their authority was being quietly challenged. The former catcher, standing between these perspectives, began to connect what others treated as separate events. In doing so, he came to suspect that the system he had once enforced was being undermined not by chance, but by forms of resistance that moved beneath its surface. Within these accounts, another figure appeared with striking consistency, though never in a way that could be fully confirmed. Described in varying terms, she was often referred to as a woman dressed in grey, seen at the edges of events where control had faltered. In some tellings, she appeared briefly, offering guidance or creating distraction before disappearing again. In others, she was less a person than a presence, invoked to explain moments when the expected order of things failed. These stories circulated most often in oral form, carried by those whose experiences were rarely recorded in official documents. From a folkloric perspective, such a figure can be understood as part of a tradition in which communities under pressure create narratives that give shape to hope and justice. The woman in grey in this reading becomes a symbol of intervention, a way of expressing the possibility that the system's power was not absolute. Her recurrence across different accounts reflects not necessarily a single individual, but a shared need to imagine resistance as something that could appear, act, and endure. At the same time, a historical interpretation suggests a more grounded explanation. The figure may represent a composite of real individuals and networks operating within and against the slave system, those who facilitated escape, passed information, or disrupted the movement of traders. Elements of maternal loss, the separation of families, and the quiet work of abolitionist efforts may all be embedded within the stories attributed to her. In this sense, the woman in grey becomes less a literal presence and more a reflection of the forces that enslavers feared but could not fully see or control. Amid these overlapping narratives, the young man at the centre of the Richmond auction takes on a different significance. His role in the unfolding events is not that of an otherworldly figure, but of a catalyst whose presence reveals what others attempt to conceal. His composure, his unclear origins, and the reactions he provokes all serve to expose the instability of the system around him. He does not command events, but he compels those involved to confront them. In doing so, he disrupts the assumptions that underpin the logic of ownership. Through him, the story draws attention to a fundamental contradiction. Enslavers sought to reduce human beings to property, to define their value in measurable terms and assert control over their lives. Yet the inner reality of those they claimed to own remained beyond their reach. The young man's presence makes this limitation visible. He becomes a point of tension within the narrative, where the attempt to possess collides with the persistence of individuality, memory, and will. In this way, his role extends beyond the circumstances of a single household or auction. He embodies the broader challenge that slavery could never fully resolve, the impossibility of containing human experience within the boundaries of ownership. As the story unfolds around him, it is not his actions alone that carry meaning, but the reactions he elicits. Each response, whether driven by fear, desire, or denial, reveals the strain placed upon a system that depended on control yet could not secure it completely. Through the observer who traces the pattern, the stories that blur between rumor and record, and the figure whose presence provokes revelation, the narrative moves toward the larger understanding. The events in Richmond and beyond were not isolated disruptions, but part of a wider process in which resistance, conscience, and contradiction steadily eroded the certainty that slavery required. In that erosion, the limits of the system became increasingly clear, not only to those who suffered under it, but also to those who had long believed in its permanence. As the narrative draws toward its conclusion, it becomes necessary to distinguish between what can be firmly supported by historical evidence and what has been shaped by retelling, interpretation, and the passage of time. The world described throughout this account rests on a foundation that is well documented. Richmond was a major center of the domestic slave trade, where enslaved people were confined, inspected, and sold within a system supported by legal contracts, financial institutions, and public acceptance. Records confirm that forged or manipulated papers circulated within this trade, that elite families often lived under significant debt despite outward displays of wealth, and that free black individuals were at times kidnapped and absorbed into slavery through coercion and fraud. The violence of fugitive enforcement, carried out by traders and slave catchers, further reveals how deeply coercion was embedded in the system's operation. Alongside these established realities are elements of the story that appear less certain, shaped by memory, rumor, and the need to give form to experiences that were not always recorded in official documents. Some accounts present episodes in heightened or symbolic terms, describing patterns of resistance that seem almost coordinated beyond ordinary explanation. Stories of identical dreams, sudden and simultaneous acts of defiance, or chains broken under mysterious circumstances emerge from oral traditions that blend lived experience with interpretation. These details do not necessarily function as literal records. Rather, they may preserve a memory of resistance through a kind of Gothic symbolism, reflecting the emotional truth of a society under strain, even when the precise events cannot be verified. The figure of the woman in grey, as it appears in various accounts, occupies a similar space between history and legend. Whether she represents a real individual, a composite of several actors within clandestine resistance networks, or a moral allegory shaped by those who told the story remains uncertain. What can be said with greater confidence is that networks of assistance, information, and quiet defiance did exist, and that they contributed to the growing instability of the slave system. The language of folklore may have given these efforts a more dramatic form, but it also ensured that their significance endured beyond the limits of written record. In this way, the story operates on multiple levels, combining documented structures with interpretive layers that reveal how people understood and remembered their circumstances. The uncertainty surrounding certain elements does not diminish their importance. Instead, it highlights the complexity of reconstructing a past in which many voices were suppressed or excluded from formal archives. The tension between evidence and narrative becomes part of the story itself, reminding us that history is often preserved not only in records, but in the meanings people attach to events. Taken as a whole, the account points toward a broader historical reality. Slavery in Virginia, as in much of the American South, was sustained by an interlocking system of law, finance, and force, reinforced by a culture that depended on maintaining belief in its own legitimacy. Yet that system was more fragile than it appeared. Beneath its structured routines lay constant pressures, economic uncertainty, moral contradiction, and the persistent resistance of those it sought to control. When these pressures surfaced, whether through public events like the Richmond auction or through quieter disruptions across the countryside, they revealed cracks in the foundation that could not be easily repaired. These local tensions were not isolated. They formed part of a wider transformation unfolding across the United States in the years before the Civil War. Sectional conflict deepened as debates over slavery intensified. Abolitionist movements expanded their reach, and acts of resistance, both organized and individual, challenged the authority of slaveholding society. What appeared in Richmond as a moment of excess and exposure reflected a national crisis in development, one that would soon move beyond debate into open conflict. In the end, the auction itself, whether understood as a precisely documented event, a composite of multiple occurrences, or a story shaped by memory and interpretation, serves as a powerful lens through which to view this period. It captures the central contradiction of slavery, a system built on the assertion that human beings could be reduced to property, yet constantly undermined by the reality that they could not. The more intensely that system sought to enforce its logic, the more visible its instability became. What remains, then, is not a single definitive account, but a reflection on what such stories reveal. They speak to a society attempting to sustain control through law and commerce, even as that control was challenged by resistance, conscience, and the weight of its own contradictions. They remind us that historical truth is often layered, requiring careful attention to both evidence and interpretation, and they invite a broader understanding of how systems of power endure and how they begin to unravel when the assumptions that support them are brought into question. Whether preserved as rumor, testimony, or allegory, stories like this illuminate a deeper reality of antebellum Virginia. Slavery was not merely an economic system, but a structure of fear, fraud, and moral collapse that carried the seeds of its own destruction.